It's not often that a brand new airline enters the scene, but that's exactly what recently happened with a player who boasted some pretty lofty promises. This new airline didn't order a fleet of new efficient narrow-bodies or promised a slick low-cost model. Instead, they would launch with the largest passenger aircraft in the world, the Airbus A380, and with just one of them to start. In an era when the biggest airlines in the world have been retiring their super jumbos, this UK-based startup announced that they would instead be bringing back this giant, not as a niche charter, but as the centerpiece of a luxurious, new, high-capacity transatlantic airline. And their promises around how the passenger experience was going to be were equally lofty. This newcomer is called Global Airlines. So how did their launch go? Well, this is the story of what happens when big vision and bold moves meets the cold and harsh reality of the airline world. But some of it might still surprise you, so stay tuned. Now, normally the launch of a small boutique airline wouldn't really grab much attention, but this one was different. James Asquith, a young British entrepreneur, travel influencer and the founder of Global Airlines, had a bold, attention-grabbing pitch. Global Airlines, he said, would restore glamour to air travel, not just with better food or more legroom, but by launching a brand new airline built around a radical new concept. Global would operate 5 classes of service instead of the normal 3 or 4. There would be economy, premium economy, business class and first class. That's 4, and so far so good, a bit fancy and complicated maybe for a new entrant, but not entirely unusual. But the 5th option would be something that he called gamer class, an onboard video game section meant to appeal to the younger passengers. Details were quite scant, but there were hints of pods equipped with gaming consoles where users could play against each other, among other things. Of course, there would also be cocktail bars, onboard lounges and extra space for all, but it was the choice of aircraft that probably raised the most eyebrows, at least from industry insiders. Asquith announced that he had acquired a used Airbus A380 outright and that he had plans to operate transatlantic flights from London to New York and Los Angeles, where 3 more A380s would then later join the fleet. Now, that choice of aircraft was a bold one, to say the least. We'll come back to that shortly, but for now, let's say that launching with a huge aircraft like this is a huge bet. Not just on the successes of Global's ability to fill seats, but also on their ability to reliably deliver a good product, to be on time and to avoid technical issues. Operating with the world's largest super jumbo is a task so hard that many of the world's largest airlines have either retired their Airbus A380s already or decided never to buy them in the first place. So the A380 was a quite strange choice and a heck of a bombshell to open with. Either way, this would be a full-service airline aimed at premium passengers and budget travelers alike. And Asquith claimed that Global would offer absolute luxury, but somehow also affordable. So it's not surprising then that the concept generated enormous buzz online, even as the industry skeptics also of course started lining up. Now, Global's branding was sleek, the renderings looked fantastic, and thousands of people on social media were soon both intrigued and excited about what was going to come. So, how did that revival go then? Well, for starters, an early hint that not everything was as promised was that Global Airlines never obtained its proper licensing. Despite early claims that they had approvals in place, Global did not secure their own Air Operator Certificate, or AOC, which is the foundational legal document needed to operate an airline. Getting one of those can take years and require deep regulatory scrutiny, financial transparency, as well as experienced staff. But Global didn't have that yet, and they didn't want to wait to get it either. So they instead outsourced. Rather than flying under their own AOC, Global ended up partnering with Hi-Fly Malta, a subsidiary of a Portuguese charter operator called Hi-Fly, to handle all of their flight operations. Now, this is not actually that uncommon. In industry terms, this is called a wet lease, when one airline provides the aircraft, crew, maintenance and insurance, and another airline essentially pays to use it. And that is exactly what Highfly did for Global. They provided the pilots, the operational control, and at least some of the cabin crew, whilst Global got to put their logo on the plane and on the tickets. Now, this arrangement is different from a dry lease, where a company only leases the aircraft itself from another airline or a lessor and then provides everything else. A dry lease is what most established airlines use when they want to expand their fleet but can't or won't wait for a new plane to come from the manufacturer. A wet lease, on the other hand, is more common for pop-up charters or temporary fixes like unexpected spikes in seasonal demand, for example. Now, this arrangement also isn't very unusual for new entrants trying to get airborne quickly, but it comes with some quite significant downsides, like normally it is very expensive. Lease payments are due every month, whether you fly or not, so this arrangement is generally only profitable if you can keep the plane flying constantly and keep those seats full. If you can't do that, well then every half-empty flight that you do will become a financial nightmare. So that would be tough for any new entrant to pull off in general, even with a small fleet of Boeing 737s or Airbus A320s, not to mention with an Airbus A380, because that jet means paying for massive capacity, high fuel burn and large crews without the scale or infrastructure of a mature airline. The point here is that for a supposedly full-service airline with big ambitions, relying on a wet lease meant that Global wasn't in control of its own operations. Instead, it was more like a branded wrapper around someone else's flight, and that's with some pretty hefty promises on how that other operator would perform in terms of service and quality. Still, to their huge credit, their inaugural flight actually did happen. But before we get to how that went, it's worth pointing out that using a wet lease is perfectly doable from a safety standpoint. The company contracted will always have to stand up to regulatory scrutiny, just like any other airline, and in fact, that's part of what a leasing party is paying big money for. And when we're on the subject of safety protocols, let me ask you something. When was the last time that you did some safety checks of your online habits? You see, cyber criminals are getting more and more sophisticated every day. So now what might have looked like a perfectly legitimate news article to you or a good shopping site might actually be designed to steal your information. That's why I always recommend you to use today's sponsor, NordVPN. Nord is the only VPN with official certification from independent cybersecurity testers. Its Threat Protection Pro feature automatically scans every website before you visit it, blocking phishing attempts, malware and trackers. In the first 3 months of 2025 alone, it blocked over 314 million scams, protecting people just like you from having their data stolen or their devices infected. Now, I travel a lot, so Nord is great for staying connected and accessing research from anywhere without losing internet speed, and even when I'm not using the VPN, the security features are still working. Right now, you can get 4 extra months for free when you sign up for the 2-year plan at nordvpn.com/mentornow or by scanning this QR code. Plus, Nord always gives you a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there is absolutely zero risk in trying them out. Thank you so much, Nord, for supporting us and the channel. Now let's go back to Global. So in May of 2025, Global's first and at that time only Airbus A380 took up from Glasgow and flew over to New York's JFK airport with paying passengers on board. Well, sort of, but I'll get back to that. Now, obviously, this wasn't a brand new aircraft that they were using. Instead, it was 12 years old at the time and had first entered service with China Southern Airlines before being stored and then rebranded in Global's colors and flying under its new registration 9 Hotel Golf Lima Oscar Bravo Lima. That first flight was then followed by a few more, JFK over to London, Manchester to New York, each one promoted to the aviation world as a glimpse of what Global Airlines was really all about. Now, here it's worth talking about one thing that Global Airlines did very well, especially before their first flights. They got a lot of clicks. Several months ahead of their first flight, Global had managed to generate a massive amount of social media buzz, including, like I mentioned, renderings of the coming cabin layouts, the mock-ups of the unique gamer class and seating that they were promising. There were also teasers of caviar service and, of course, the almost mandatory photos of the company founder posing inside of the Airbus A380 cockpit, where he was telling stories about the extensive work that they had done in order to get the aircraft back into working order after having been stored in the desert. Now, to keep up that social media interest, a large number of the passengers on board Global's inaugural flight were going to be influencers and travel vloggers, some of them flying on Global's dime, but certainly not all of them, which is worth remembering here. Now, I was actually invited myself to this first flight, or I think maybe it was the second one, but I couldn't go because I had some other things booked on those particular dates. Anyway, if you are going to invite influencers whose job it is to review airlines and travel experiences, well then you better have all of your ducks in a row, which unfortunately did not really happen here. First of all, the passenger numbers on the first few flights were not that great, to say the least. On a jet with seats for over 500 people, the inaugural Glasgow to JFK flight carried about 170 passengers, including most of those vloggers. Later flights reportedly had even fewer people on board, some with under 100 passengers, which is obviously far below what would be needed just to cover the lease payments, let alone fuel and supplies like food. And the passenger experience? How was that? Well, according to those same travel influencers, it was mixed at best. The cabin hadn't been refurbished yet, so it still featured the original China Southern interiors, which had certainly seen some better days. The business class seats, where long-haul airlines' profit margins usually comes from, at least for the most part, were old and dated. Many seats had worn armrests and lacked seat-backed entertainment, and to compensate for that, economy passengers were handed iPads, preloaded with a limited selection of videos. But then there was the small matter of the service, which, according to the influencers, was slow and underwhelming, despite the low passenger numbers. Some food was served cold after a really long wait, and obviously, since the cabin wasn't refurbished, the much touted gamer class didn't appear at all. Despite the promises of caviar, lounges and innovation, the passengers actually got an aircraft that looked okay from the outside, but still really felt like an old dated plane once they got inside. So even though Global had the branding, the buzz and loads of followers on social media, as an exercise in expectation management, those first flights definitely left more to ask. And here is likely a lesson to learn. You see, everyone loves an upstart, something with passion and drive to change the status quo, and in a position like that, which Global definitely had, they were poised to come out as a winner, just by the feat of getting an Airbus A380 flying. But the key in that situation is always to under-promise and over-deliver, not the other way around. On top of everything else, Global were attempting to launch services between the UK and New York, one of the most heavily trafficked and competitive air routes in the world. There are currently already 8 airlines serving these routes, with dozens of flights between them every day, all offering different price points and luxury levels. So, a few weeks after those first flights, Global's Airbus A380 was sent for maintenance in Dresden and was then quietly moved into long-term storage in Tarbes in France. So just like that, the question shifted from when are they launching to was that it? Now, the future of global airlines seems to be very much up in the air, even though their plane is not. But to be fair, they would hardly be the first startup to try launching with a bold vision and a unique business model. Now, these promises, the fanfare, the flashy jets, the financial fog, would all be familiar to many aviation insiders. An old infamous example of this was Baltia Airlines, founded in August of 1989, and who promised luxury transatlantic services from New York to Eastern Europe using a refurbished Boeing 747. They also bought a plane, released renderings and even announced ticket sales, but in the last 35 years, they've never flown a single paying passenger. Baltia are now called US Global Airways and have failed their certification process with the FAA repeatedly, which means that they realistically have no path forward to ever becoming a real airline. Now, to be very clear here, global airlines are not like that. They actually provided paying passengers with the trips that they had booked, but there are a lot of similarities with Global's flashy promises to investors and customers. Then we also have the likes of EOS Airlines, MaxJet and Silverjet, who all launched in the mid-2000s with a different idea. All business-class transatlantic flights, smaller planes, fewer seats, high-end service. In other words, sort of the same niche that Global claims to be after, but much more focused and scaled sensibly. But even those airlines went bankrupt soon after starting their service, and this was because within a few years, spiking fuel prices, dipping demand or other factors got in the way in one way or another, and they just didn't have the scale or financial muscles to ride it through. Even airlines like WOW Air and Norwegian Air Shuttle, which we've actually covered on this channel before, tried the long-haul low-cost model, and they used much more modern aircraft, but they just couldn't make the economics work long term. So the takeaway here should be quite simple. Even with better timing and a smarter, more efficient fleet than Global had, launching a transatlantic airline is an incredibly risky and hard endeavor to do, and the more ambitious the concept, the more ways there are for things to go wrong. Now, we haven't written the final chapter on Global Airlines just yet, but when we're on the subject, you might ask, are there any examples of airlines that tried this and actually succeeded? And actually, yeah, there is. La Compagnie is a tiny French airline that flies just 2 Airbus A321neos at the moment, with 2 more on order. That choice of aircraft helps the airline keep their operating costs in check, since Airbus A321 parts have a large and well-known supply chain. There's also a big pool of Airbus A320 qualified pilots and engineers, and the planes fit at airports of any size with reasonable handling costs. La Compagnie fly their planes at a 2-to-2 all business class configuration with only 76 passengers, and they do so from Paris and Nice over to New York and back. Now, this is not a super flashy operation, but it's disciplined, small scale, low costs, and in a narrow and well-defined niche. On top of that, La Compagnie also chose to tackle markets that were less congested, and they further avoided delay risks by ordering off-the-shelf 2 across lie-flat seats and not insisting on complicated and unique seating as we have talked about in a recent video. So this company found a model that works by focusing on a small but loyal fan base and competing against the major airlines by being ruthlessly efficient. And Global Airlines so far has not shown that they can do any of that. But even if you ignore all of the branding, the finances and the startup drama, Global Airlines was always going to face one massive, unavoidable challenge, which brings me back to their choice of aircraft. Now, anyone who has flown in the Airbus A380 absolutely loves it, but it is not a startup-friendly plane. And if you want to understand why, you only have to look at who is actually the main user of it today. The reality is that for a plane like the A380 to make economic sense, it has to be full, not just on the launch day or during the holiday season, but basically every single day of the year. Emirates is by far the biggest user of this plane, and they are able to do that because they've built a vast hub-and-spoke network centered in Dubai, connecting passengers from dozens of origins to dozens of destinations on known, very busy routes. That kind of scale let them operate multiple Airbus A380s per day on the same popular routes and still fill those seats. But even then, it's a challenge. Making the math work involves constantly fine-tuning the airline's network and prices, which is only possible really if you have that kind of large scale. Other airlines, including a number of flag carriers, use them to service massive trunk routes or to fly into the airport with tight slot restrictions, but even they have had limited success in doing that profitably. Qatar Airways and Etihad, 2 other Gulf carriers with robust networks that share Emirates' strategic location, have actually struggled to keep their Airbus A380s viable, partially because they each only had about 10 of these jets, which was not enough to keep flexibility up. And that obviously begs the question. If major global players with deep pockets and multiple long-haul destinations can't consistently make the Airbus A380 work, then how would a single aircraft startup with no feeder network hope to do just that? You see, whether Global had one Airbus A380 or 10, they would still face the same brutal problem. There simply isn't enough consistent demand to keep a jet like that profitable without the infrastructure and scale to back it up. Depending on configuration and length of flight, an Airbus A380 can cost between $25,000 and $35,000 per flight hour. And to give you an idea of the scale here, that's more than twice the hourly cost of a Boeing 787 or an Airbus A350. The Airbus A380 burns more fuel, takes longer to board, requires more crew and more maintenance than smaller twin jets do. So for the numbers to work, it has to carry more passengers and sometimes even at higher prices than the other planes do. Secondly, there's the infrastructure issue. You see, not every airport can even handle the Airbus A380. It needs wide taxiways, extra tall jet bridges and reinforced parking stands, which, you guessed it, cost more money. JFK and Heathrow fit the bill, but they're also slot constrained and extremely expensive, so that's a high bar for a new airline to clear, especially without a frequent schedule or alliance partners feeding you on a regular basis with domestic traffic. And then there is the reliability and maintenance issues. You see, Airbus has obviously stopped building the Airbus A380s, and as time goes by, its spare parts and maintenance will therefore become harder and more expensive, possibly causing more frequent downtimes. And if something does go wrong, Global then doesn't have a real backup. They only have one plane right now, so if that one is in for repair, well then the entire airline either stops operating or have to lease in extra planes at crazy prices. Something their passengers, who might have then wanted their gamer pods, wouldn't really be that thrilled about. On top of that, if a technical fault would be found just before a flight, for example, and they can't get it back online quickly, well then they would have to rebook hundreds of passengers on competitor airlines. Even Highfly, the well-established wet lease operator that Global worked with, tried to run a single A380 for charters a while back, but after just 2 years they gave up, since there simply wasn't enough demand to keep it profitable. So for Global Airlines, the Airbus A380 was always going to be a high-stakes bet, one that required enormous scale, flawless logistics and consistent demand, and preferably quite a bit of experience too. I personally think that the reason for the reported poor customer experience on those first flights was partly due to the fact that Global didn't have all of their own crew trained and working in the cabin. You see, the customers in first class at least did get caviar, but if the rest of the meal then comes late, is cold and the service is felt to be subpar, that's going to be blamed on the airline that sold the ticket, not the wet leasing company who provides the staff. I just don't think people realize just how much routine, work and attention to detail it takes to provide a true luxury experience in the airline world today. Because of the higher prices that the passengers pay, people are expecting nothing less than the very best, and anything that falls short of that will not be easily forgiven. So the only way to provide this is by dedicated, trained, in-house crew, flawless supply chain and an airline structure that provides that feeling of quality from the check-in desks through the lounges, out to the aircraft and all the way to the destination airport. And that is no small feat, and certainly not something that can be wet leased out easily. So what will happen to Global Airlines now then? Well, the official word is that the Airbus A380 is undergoing maintenance and upgrades, that the airline is simply pausing between phases and that more flights will still come. The idea is that they might resume service later in 2025 or 2026, and that is perfectly possible, but most people aren't really holding their breath. Some news suggests that Global could pivot over to aircraft crew maintenance and insurance, or ACMI leasing, essentially flipping the script and renting their Airbus A380 out to other airlines for charters, just as Highfly tried before. But even that market is saturated. and the track record of the Airbus A380 charters are not great. And on top of that, Global would of course then really need that air operator certificate to make it happen. So even if I would find it really sad, it is entirely possible that Global Airlines is already over. That the flights that they did operate were their entire arc, and if it is, it wouldn't have been the first time. But I really want to emphasize that in the end, Global Airlines did do something that most startup carriers never managed. They got an Airbus A380 into the air with their name on the side and with paying passengers on board. That's actually way further than the dozens of other paper airline projects who lived and died on pitch decks and press releases ever got to go. And I kind of love the go-get attitude of the management team behind Global. I just wish that they would have stuck with less ambitious aircraft and more of an underdog profile from the start. What do you think? Would you have been interested to fly with Global Airlines? Let me know what you think down in the comments here below, and if you want to discuss this directly with me, then join my Patreon crew by scanning this QR code or by going to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. Also, remember to check out NordVPN. I'm really happy to have them behind me, helping me and my team create this kind of content. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor now. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.